A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. December 1843.
Stave 1, Marley's Ghost.
Marley was dead, to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good pawn change for anything he chose to put his hand to.
Old Marley was dead as a doornail.
Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will, therefore, permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail.
Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and that he solemnized it with an undoubted bargain.
The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind.
Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterward above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him.
Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas.
External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did.
Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks,
My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?
No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming would tug their owners up doorways and courts and would wag their tails, as though they said,
No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master.
But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge.
once upon a time, of all the good days of the year, on Christmas Eve, Old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and it was so dense without that although the court was nearmost, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale.
The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller than that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!
Cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of the approach.
Bah! Humbug!
He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again.
Christmas a humbug, Uncle! You don't mean that, I am sure.
I do. Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough.
Come then, what right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose?
Scrooge,
You're
having no
rich
better
enough.
answer, ready on the spur of the moment, said,
Bah! Humbug!
Don't be cross, Uncle.
What else can I be? When I live in such a world of fools as this, Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer. A time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a dozen rounds of months presented dead against you. If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should.
Uncle!
Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine.
Keep it, but you don't keep it.
Then let me leave it alone then. Much good it may do you, much good it has ever done anyone.
There are many things from which I might have derived good, but which I have not profited, I dare say. Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will do me good. And I say, God bless it.
The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever.
Let me hear another sound from you, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder why you don't go into Parliament.
Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow.
Fred said in a pleading voice. Scrooge said that he would see them. Oh, yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see them as soon as he died.
But why? Why?
Why did you get married?
Because I fell in love.
Because you fell in love.
Growled Scrooge, as if that were the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas.
Good afternoon.
Nay, Uncle, but you can never come see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?
Good afternoon.
I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon.
I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle!
Good afternoon!
And a Happy New Year!
Good afternoon.
Said Scrooge one final time, pointing to the door. His nephew left the room without an angry word notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially.
There's another fellow. My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him.
Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?
Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years.
Oh.
He died 7 years ago this very night.
Well, we have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Oh, plenty of prisons.
And the union workhouses? Are they still in operation?
Oh, they are, still. Although I wish they were not.
The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then?
Oh, both very busy, sir.
Oh. I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it.
Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall we put you down for?
Nothing.
Oh, you wish to be anonymous.
I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there.
Well, many can't go there, and many would rather die.
If they would rather die, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. It is not my business. It's not enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Scrooge replied meanly, and seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge returned to his labors with an improved opinion of himself and a more facetious temper than was the actual with him.
Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flares, offering their services to go before horses in carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff, old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of the Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours and quarters from the clouds. The cold became intense.
The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and baby sailed out to buy the beef.
Foggier yet and colder. Piercing, searching, biting cold. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of
God
Bless ye merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay.
Scrooge seized a ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog in even more congenial frost.
At length the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and told his clerk that it was time to close. The clerk instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose.
If quite convenient, sir.
It is not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I suppose. And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work.
But sir, it's but once a year.
A poor man's excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning.
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, hurried home to play with his children.
Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and passing the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in a gloomy set of rooms which had once belonged to his deceased partner. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge.
Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It was also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place, and that Scrooge had little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. Let yet it also be kept in mind that Scrooge had not spent one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that very afternoon. It seems odd, then, that Scrooge's, having his key in the lock in the door, saw in the knocker, not a knocker, but Marley's face.
Marley's face. It had a dismal light about it, not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again.
Startled, he put his hand upon the key, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He paused for a moment before he shut the door, looking cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified at the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said,
Bah! Humbug!
and closed it with a bang.
Scrooge fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. He checked each room as he got to them: sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guards, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker.
Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus, secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat before the fire to take his gruel.
Shortly, he sat down in his favorite chair, and he threw his head back. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw the bell begin to swing. It swung so softly at the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house.
This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains.
The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise, much louder, on the floors below. Then, coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door.
It's humbug. I won't believe it.
His color changed, though, when without a pause it came through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again.
That same face. The very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind.
Though he looked the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound round its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he still did not believe his eyes.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much.
Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who were you then?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
I can.
Well, do it then.
You don't believe in me.
I don't.
What evidence do you need of my reality beyond that of your senses?
I don't know.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You might be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more gravy than grave about you, whatever you are.
The ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. The spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face and cried out,
"Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?"
Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
I do. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk around among his fellows and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness.
Again, the specter raised a mournful cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands.
You are fettered. Tell me why.
I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as full and heavy and as long as this 7 Christmases ago. You have observed on it since. It is a ponderous chain.
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Of the ghost he asked imploringly,
Jacob, oh Jacob Marley, speak, tell me more, speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give, Ebenezer Scrooge, except I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. My time is nearly gone. I'm here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. I offer you a chance and hope as an Ebenezer.
You are always a good friend to me, and I thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?
It is. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?
Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us.
When it had said these words, the specter stood, wound its chain over and about its arm, and walked backwards from him to the window, which had raised itself wide open. It beckoned Scrooge approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, and the specter, after listening for a moment, floated out upon the bleak, dark night.
Looking out, Scrooge saw that the air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost, in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, but had lost the power forever.
Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable and went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant.
Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits.
Scrooge awoke to the chimes of a neighboring church striking the 4 quarters. So he listened for the hour, and he heard a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn.
The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor.
It was a strange figure. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, and a cap tucked under its arm.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past. What? Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?
Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend of any knowledge of having willfully bonneted the Spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there, and the Spirit of Christmas Past replied,
Your welfare.
Well, I am much obliged, but I cannot help but think that a night of unbroken rest would be more conducive to that end.
Your reclamation, then. Take heed. Rise and walk with me.
It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped Scrooge gently by the arm. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the Spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. In a whine, Scrooge said,
I am mortal and liable to fall.
Bear but a touch of my hand there, and you shall be upheld in more than this,
said the Spirit, laying it upon Scrooge's heart. And as the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness in the midst had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day, with snow upon the ground.
Good heaven! I was bred in this place. I was a boy here.
The Spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares, long, long forgotten.
Your lip is trembling. And what is that upon your cheek?
Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would.
You recollect the way?
Remember it? I could walk it blindfold.
Strange to have forgotten it for so many years.
Observed the Spirit as they walked along the road. Scrooge recognized every gate and post and tree until a little market town appeared on the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies were seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in the country gigs and carts, driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it.
These are but shadows of the things that have been. They have no consciousness of us.
Scrooge knew and named them, everyone. Why was he so happy to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out on Merry Christmas. What good had it ever done him? After time, the Spirit spoke.
The school is not quite deserted. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still.
Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed.
They left the high road by a well-remembered lane and soon approached a mansion of dull, red brick, a large house, but the spacious offices were little used, their walls damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed.
They went in, the ghost and Scrooge, and crossed a hall to the door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain forms and desks. At one of these was a lonely boy reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be.
The Spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, Scrooge said in pity for the former self,
Poor boy.
and cried again.
I wish.
Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him, after drying his eyes with his cuff.
But it's too late now.
What is the matter?
Nothing. Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something. That's all.
The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so,
Let us see another Christmas.
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays.
He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and, putting her arms around his neck and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother.
I have come to bring you home, dear brother, to bring you home, home, home.
Home, little fan?
Yes, home for good and all, home forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you, and you're to be a man. First we were to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world.
You're quite a woman, little fan.
exclaimed young Scrooge to his dear little sister. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood up on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him, in her near childish eagerness, towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her.
Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart.
So she had. You're right. I cannot deny it, Spirit.
She died a woman and had, as I think, children.
One child.
True. Your nephew.
Yes.
In but a moment, they left the school behind them and were now in a busy thoroughfares of a city where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It made plain enough, but by the dressing of the shops, it was here too Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up.
The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it! I was apprenticed here.
They went in at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement.
Why, it's old Fezziwig, bless his heart! It's Fezziwig alive again!
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen, looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice.
Yo, ho there, Mr. Scrooge, Mr. Wilkins.
Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
Richard Wilkins, to be sure, bless me, yes, there he is. Well, he was very much attached to me, was Richard. Ah, poor Richard. Dear, dear.
Said Scrooge to the ghost, just as Fezziwig spoke merrily to the young men.
Yo, my boys, no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Richard. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, and before a man can say Jack Robinson.
You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, had them up in their places, 4, 5, 6, barred them and pinned them, 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses.
Hilly-ho!
cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility.
Oh, clear away, my lads, and let's have a lot of room here. Hilly-ho, Richard. Cheer up, Ebenezer.
Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry as a bright ballroom as you would ever desire to see on a winter's night.
In came a fiddler with a music book. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial, and 3 Miss Fezziwigs, along with 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business, the house help and the neighbors. There were dances, and there was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer, and more dances.
When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop.
During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Richard were turned from them, and that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear.
The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 apprentices, who are pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said,
He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?
It isn't that,
Said Scrooge, heated by the remark and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self.
It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. To say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up, what then? The happiness he gives us is quite as great as if it had cost a fortune.
What is the matter?
Nothing in particular.
Something, I think.
No. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all.
His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air.
My time grows short. Quick!
This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again, Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. His face is not that harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. He was not alone, but he sat by the side of a fair young girl in a morning dress, in whose eyes were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. Softly, she said,
It matters little. To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve.
What idol has displaced you?
A golden one.
This is the even-handed dealing of the world. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth.
You fear the world too much. All your other hopes have merged into one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you.
Well, what then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. Am I?
Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until, in good season, we can improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man.
I was a boy.
Your own feeling tells you that you are not what you are. I am. That which promised happiness when we are one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly have I thought of this? I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you.
Have I ever sought release?
In words, no, never.
In what then?
In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end, and everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us, tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me? Now? No.
Said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him. He seemed to yield to the justice of the supposition, in spite of himself. But he said, with a struggle,
You think not.
I would gladly think otherwise if I could, heaven knows. When I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl, you who, in your very confidence with her, weigh everything by gain, or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so? Do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. You may, the memory of what is half past makes me hope you will, have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it, gladly, as an unprofitable dream from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen.
She left him, and they parted. And Scrooge implored of the spirit,
Spirits, show me no more, conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?
One shadow more.
No more. No more, I do not wish to see it. Show me no more.
But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room, not very large, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count. But no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much.
But now a knocking at the door was heard, and all rushed to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden by Christmas toys and presents. There were shouts of wonder and delight at every package received. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they're all indescribable alike, and later, off to bed to dream the delightful dreams of children.
Seated comfortably and happily by the fire, the husband turned to his wife and said with a smile,
Belle, I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon.
Who was it?
Guess.
How can I? I don't know. Mr. Scrooge.
Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat, alone. Actually, quite alone in the world, I do believe.
Spirit, remove me from this place.
I told you these were shadows of the things that have been, that they are what they are. Do not blame me.
Remove me, I cannot bear it.
Scrooge turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which, in some strange way, were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it.
Leave me, take me back, haunt me no longer.
Scrooge seized the spirit's extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head, and the spirit dropped beneath it. Scrooge was suddenly aware of being in his own bedroom, conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and soon he sank into a heavy sleep.
Stave 3. the second of the three spirits.
Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. Observing a bright light shining from under his door, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed.
It was his own room. There was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne where turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me,
said the spirit. Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe, or mantle, bordered with white fur. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. He spoke in a voice friendly and almost as a laugh.
You have never seen the like of me before.
Never.
The ghost of Christmas present rose. As he did, Scrooge spoke submissively.
Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast, and they were instantly transported to the city streets on Christmas morning. The last deposit snow had been plowed up in the deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain.
The people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen. There was hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes, oranges, and lemons.
But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes. At the sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, and perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off his power, or else it was his own kind that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks, for there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding his robe. And on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that, Bob, but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays, but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house.
There was Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, and Master Peter Cratchit, who plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar into his mouth. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table.
What has ever got your precious father then? And your brother, Tiny Tim?
She had no longer asked when in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. The 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
And how did little Tim behave?
Oh, as good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He actually told me coming home that he hoped people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see.
Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. Tiny Tim's active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back he came before another word was spoken. Escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, which they soon returned in high procession.
Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner of the table. The 2 young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons in their mouths. At last the dishes were set on, and the grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, preparing to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose among all the board. And even Tiny Tim, excited by the 2 young Cratchits, beat on the table with the hands of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!"
When everyone had had enough, the plates were changed by Miss Belinda, and Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone to take the pudding up and bring it in.
Oh, and a wonderful pudding enjoyed by all. And when at last the dinner was all done, the table cleared, and drinks served round, Bob proposed,
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us.
Which all the family re-echoed, and Tiny Tim echoed the last of all.
God bless us, everyone.
Tiny Tim sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Scrooge asked of the Spirit, with an interest he had never felt before.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, 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 kind Spirit, say he will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the Spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. The Spirit said to him,
It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child.
Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name issued by Bob as a toast.
Mr. Scrooge. I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
My dear, the children, Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
Well, I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
Well, the children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes.
And now, without a word of warning, Scrooge found himself standing in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side and listening to the laughter of his own nephew, Fred. There is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he. And their assembled friends, being not a bit by hound, roared out lustily. He said that Christmas was humbug, as I live, and he believed it too.
More shame for him, Fred.
Said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They're always in earnest. And Fred replied,
He's a comical old fellow, and that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him.
I'm sure he's very rich, Fred. At least you always tell me so.
And what of that, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he is ever going to benefit us with it.
I have no patience with him.
Oh, I have. I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself. Always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose much of a dinner.
Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner.
interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight.
Well, I am very glad to hear it. I only meant that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail against Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk 50 pounds, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday.
It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge. But, being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, just so that they laughed at any rate, Fred encouraged them in their merriment.
With no little enjoyment, Scrooge watched as the gathering pressed past. They're even playing a game at blind man's buff, and then a game of how, when, and where, in which he himself joined the guessing. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and Scrooge begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But the spirit said could not be done.
Here is a new game. 1/2 hour, spirit, only one.
It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, his wife, falling into a similar state, cried out,
I've found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is.
What is it?
It's your Uncle Scrooge.
Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. And Fred exclaimed,
He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, and it would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge!
Uncle Scrooge.
Oh, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it nevertheless. To Uncle Scrooge!
Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were once again upon their travels.
Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, in almshouses, hospital and jail, in misery's every refuge, and left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts.
As quickly as before, and as unexpected, Scrooge found himself once more in his chambers, alone. As he heard the clock strike 12, he looked about for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
Stave 4, the last of the spirits.
The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible, save one outstretched hand. Before this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. Scrooge surmised,
I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand.
You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, Spirit?
The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer Scrooge received.
Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover.
Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any specter I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?
It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. Scrooge said,
Lead on. Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, Spirit.
the phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along.
They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, in the heart of it, on Change Street, amongst the merchants who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets and conversed in groups and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals. and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often.
The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk.
No, I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead.
When did he die?
Last night, I believe.
Why? What was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die.
God knows.
What has he done with his money?
I haven't heard. He left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know. It's likely to be a very cheap funeral. For upon my life, I don't know anybody that will go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer.
I don't mind going if lunch is provided, but I must be fed.
Well, I am the most disinterested among you, after all, for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch, but I'll offer to go, if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Well, bye-bye.
Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here.
He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He'd made a point of always standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view.
How are you?
How are you?
Well, old Scratch has gone his way at last, eh?
So I'm told. Cold, isn't it?
Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose.
No. Something else to think of. Good morning.
Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting.
Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was the past. And this ghost province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself, to whom he could apply them.
He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he'd been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought he hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this.
Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people slipshod and ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offenses of smell, and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery.
In a low-browed shop below a penthouse roof sat a raggedy, gray-haired rascal, a man nearly 70 years of age, sitting among the wares he dealt in. Scrooge and the phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too. She was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, all three burst into laugh.
The first woman to arrive threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with a bold defiance at the other two, said to the other woman, "What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber? Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did."
That's true indeed, no man more so.
"Why, then? Don't stand staring as if you were afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose."
No, indeed, we should hope not.
"Very well, then. That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose."
No, indeed.
If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, why wasn't he a natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying, gasping out his last there, alone by himself.
It's the truest word that ever was spoke. It's a judgment on him.
With some care, as though presenting their materials for a market, they each in turn presented Old Joe with the wares they had to offer. The man in faded black was first to produce his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and appraised by Old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come. To the man, he said,
That's your account, and I wouldn't give you another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?
Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner.
I always give too much to the ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself. That's your account. Now, if you ask me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent my being so liberal and knock off half a crown.
And now undo my bundle, Joe.
Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff.
What do you call this? Bed curtains?
Bed curtains.
You don't mean to say you took him down rings at all with him just lying there?
Yes, I do. And why not?
Oh, you're born to make a fortune, and you'll certainly do it.
I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching out, for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now.
His blankets?
Whose else's do you think? He isn't likely to take the cold without them, I dare say.
Well, I hope he didn't die of anything catchy, eh?
Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, and shuddering from head to foot, said,
Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?
Scrooge recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language.
Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the specter at his side. Again he spoke.
Spirit, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. Let us go.
Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head.
I understand you, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit, I have not the power. If there is any person in town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, show me that person. Spirit, I beseech you.
The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire.
Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were all as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet.
Where could your father be? It must be near his time.
Past it, rather. But I think he's walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother.
They were very quiet again. At last, she said in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once,
I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed.
And so have I, often.
But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. And there is your father at the door.
She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter. And he had need of it. Poor fellow. Come in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid, each child, a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, Father. Don't be so grieved."
Sunday. You went today then, Robert?
Yes, my dear. Oh, I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is, but you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child. My little child.
He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. He was reconciled to what had happened and soon went down again, quite happy.
The family drew about the fire and talked. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he'd scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street but that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, related Bob, inquired what happened to distress him.
On which, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you have ever heard, I told him, and he says to me, I'm heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, and heartily sorry for your good wife. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray, come to me. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim, and he felt with us.
I'm sure he's a good soul.
But however, and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us. I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it.
No.
Never, Father.
I am very happy, very happy.
Bob said to his beloved family as Scrooge and the ghost looked on.
Spectre,
Said
something
Scrooge.
informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me, what man was that whom we saw lying dead?
The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these latter visions, save that they were in the future, but showed him not himself.
These courts through which we hurry now is where my place of occupation is and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come.
The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere.
The house is yonder, spirit. Why do you point away?
The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed, as before.
They went on until they reached an iron gate. Scrooge paused to look around before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, choked up with too much burying. A worthy place.
The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in the solemn shape, and said,
Before I draw near to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
Am I the man who lay upon that bed?
Scrooge cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No, Spirit, no, Spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man that I have been. Why show me this if I had past all hope?
For the first time, the hand appeared to shake, and Scrooge took hope. And he fell down upon the ground, saying,
Good Spirit, your nature pities me. Assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life.
The kind hand trembled.
I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirit of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on that stone.
In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost.
Stave 5, the end of it.
Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in.
I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven in the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, oh Jacob, on my knees.
He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He'd been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears.
They are not torn down.
Cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms.
They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will.
Oh, his hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance, laughing and crying in the same breath, and struggling with his stockings, he said.
I don't know what to do. I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New World. Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there. Hello.
He had frisked into the sitting room and was now standing there, perfectly winded, but exclaiming nonetheless.
There's the saucepan that the gruel was in. There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. There's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. It's all right. It's all true. It all happened.
Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh, the father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs.
I don't know what day of month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello out there! Hello!
He was checked in his thoughts by the church bells ringing out in the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious! Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist. Clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold, cold, piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet, fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious! And he called downward to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him.
What's today?
What?
What's today, my fine fellow?
Oh, today, why, Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day!
Said Scrooge excitedly to himself.
I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, they can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Oh, hello, my fine fellow.
Hello.
Do you know the poulterers in the next street, but one at the corner?
Oh, I should hope I did.
an intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one.
What? The one as big as me?
What a delightful boy. It's such a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck.
Well, it's hanging there now.
Is it? Well, go and buy it.
Right, sure.
No, I am in earnest. Go and buy it and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them direction where to take it. Come back with the man and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes and I'll give you half a crown.
The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have got a shot off half so fast. Rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh, old Scrooge whispered to himself,
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit. He won't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim.
The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did, somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye. Patting it with one hand, he said,
I shall love it as long as I live. I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. It's a wonderful door knocker. Here's my turkey. Hello, how are you? Merry Christmas.
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for a cab to deliver it to Cratchit's humble home, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down, breathless, in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried.
He dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present. And walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you. And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears.
He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before and said, Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. It sent a pang across his heart to think about how the old gentleman would look upon him when he met. But he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it. Quickening his pace and taking the old gentleman by both hands, he said,
My dear sir, how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir.
Mr. Scrooge?
Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness...
Here Scrooge whispered in his ear,
Lord bless me. My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?
If you please, not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?
Oh, my dear sir, I don't know what to say to such munificence.
Don't say anything. Come and see me. Will you come and see me?
I will.
Thank you. I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you.
He went to church and walked about the streets and watched people hurrying to and fro and patted children on the head and questioned beggars and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up into the windows and found that everything that could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything, could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon, he turned his steps toward his nephew's house.
He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash and did it and asked the girl who answered the door.
Is your master at home, my dear?
Yes, sir.
Where is he, my love?
He's in the dining room, sir, along with mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please.
Oh, thank you. He knows me.
Said Scrooge, his hand already on the dining room lock.
I'll go in here, my dear.
He turned the latch gently and sidled his face in, round the door. They were looking at the table and preparing to sit and eat their fine Christmas meal.
Bread?
Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with the footstool, where he wouldn't have done it on any account. And Fred cried out in happy surprise,
Why, bless my soul! Who's that?
It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?
Let him in. It is a mercy that he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same, And so did all the guests. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, and wonderful happiness.
But he was early at the office the next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon.
And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. A quarter past. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with the door wide open that he might see him come into the tank.
His hat was off before he opened the door. His comforter, too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hello.
Growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it.
What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?
I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
Oh, you are. Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please.
Sir, it's only once a year, sir, and it shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary.
Bob trembled, and thinking old Scrooge had become mad, got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help and a straitjacket.
A Merry Christmas, Bob. And a Merry Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have ever given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this afternoon over a Christmas bowl of punch. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them. He thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him.
He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God bless us
all,
If
everyone.
Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you for listening.